Hello and good morning. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Chris Reed. I am the publicist at University of Toronto Press. And on behalf of everybody at UTP, I'd like to welcome you to a launch event for Nothing Less Than Great by Harvey Weingarten. And we have an illustrious panel today to discuss one of the big questions that's at the center of the book, which is what is the state of Canadian universities? And but before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land on which UTP operates. And for thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And today, this meeting place is still the unceded home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the author of the book, Harvey Weingarten. Harvey is the first principal of the School of Applied Health Sciences in the Michener Institute of Education at the University Health Network. He was formerly vice president, academic, and provost at McMaster University. And Harvey's also been president of the University of Calgary and most recently president and CEO of the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. Harvey is a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, and he's also a senior fellow at Massey College. Harvey's most recent book is Nothing Less Than Great, Reforming Canada's Universities, and it's my pleasure to hand the virtual stage over now to Harvey Weingarten.
Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. So let me say this. Why did I write this book? I wrote this book because I love universities. I love what they stand for. I love what they do. And I love what they contribute to the well-being of Canadians and to our country. In my opinion, the investment that Canada makes in its public education system is one of the smartest, most forward-looking, and most significant investments our country makes in the future of our people and as the future of the country itself. Again, in my humble opinion, Canada's public university system has served this country very well. And it represents one of the sectors, if we do this right, that allows us to be optimistic and confident about Canada's place in the crazy, competitive, complex, and sometimes rather nasty world we now find ourselves in. Our public university system is a jewel in Canada's crown. We should be rightfully proud of it and given its importance to the people who live in this country and to the country, we should strive for this system to be nothing less than great. So why did I write this book? Over the years, I became increasingly concerned about the state and future of Canada's public university system, given the experience I had in them, what I had seen and learned about our universities, and my sense of the trajectory that the university system was on. I became increasingly sure that we needed a serious relook at how we designed and delivered our undergraduate curricula. I became increasingly of the view that we would be well advised to have universities reclaim what is their central purpose. These are educational institutions that should have the students at the very center of their thinking, where we give the next generation and increasingly other people and other generations in Canada the knowledge, skills, and competencies that they need and that we need to sustain the country both economically and socially. I had a wonderful opportunity to work with terrific colleagues at the Higher Education Quality Council, where we spent a lot of time documenting the rather precarious nature and the unsustainability of our university system. I also became increasingly frustrated and worried over time about how our governments managed and regulated our universities, and how all of the bureaucracy, the rules, and the regulations were stifling innovation and creativity in our university sector. So I had many observations, many ideas, many thoughts. I had written many short pieces about these issues in the past. And I thought it would be gratifying to me and maybe even interesting and rewarding to others if I put pen to paper and assembled these into a book. And to be fair, one of my audience surely was the university sector itself. But equally, an important audience for me in the way that I wrote the book was to try to make it accessible to the public so they could better understand the contributions of our universities, their challenges, and why it was important to them that this critical public sector in Canada be great and how that would contribute to a better future for them. Throughout my career, I've been most impressed by people who have coupled analysis and research, and yes, even complaining and carping. They coupled it to solutions. So I wanted to be sure that the book also focused on solutions, a recipe for reform, about how things could be improved and how we could move from good to great. And for those of you who follow the management literature, you will know that the term good to great comes from Jim Collins. And he pointed out something very important about how you move from good to great. You have to face the brutal facts. You have to be realistic about what you are, where you are, and that's a precursor to developing policies and practices that help you improve. Moving forward, facing the brutal facts needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be data-driven. That's one of the most important lessons I ever took out of graduate school. And we have to know whether the changes we make, the reforms we make, are actually helping to improve things. And that will also require data collection, evidence, and critical analysis. And that's the perspective I tried to adopt in this book. What is the evidence? What is the data? What do they tell us? How do they guide us to solutions and to improvement? So you might ask, okay, so why'd you write the book now? And the answer to that is remarkably simple. I had the time. I had just finished a full-time job at the Higher Education Quality Council, and the people at Massey College were kind enough to offer me a year-long senior residency. My time at Massey College gave me the opportunity, the environment, as it has for so many others, to think and to write, and a lovely environment in which to do all of those things. Unfortunately, the pandemic cut my time at Massey a little short, but I do want to thank Massey for the opportunity it gave me. And equally, I want to thank all of the many wonderful colleagues I have had over the years who shaped my thinking about universities and have made an intellectual and scholarly contribution to what I wrote in the book. And I have to share that acknowledgement with them. And regrettably, there's simply not enough time to thank all of them individually. So I want to thank you for participating. I do not expect people to agree with everything I say or recommend. In fact, it would be quite disappointing to me if everyone agreed with everything in the book. But I do hope that the book elevates the discussion about and the attention on and the focus on Canada's universities, all to the goal of improving the sector and allowing it to do more and better for the country, and to make sure that Canada's public university system is nothing less than great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harvey. And I would like to now introduce our esteemed moderator. We're very, very fortunate and delighted to have John Fraser with us to moderate today's conversation. John is probably well known to everybody here, but I will just remind everybody that John is a widely celebrated Canadian journalist, writer, and academic. He's the founding president and CEO of the National News Media Media Council, the principal media ethics watchdog in Canada. John currently serves as the council's executive chair. And Harvey was just speaking about Massey College, and of course, John served there as master of Massey College from 1995 to 2014, and he taught a course on the history of newspapers at the University of Toronto. John's played several prominent roles, everything from national columnist, foreign correspondent, and Ottawa bureau chief at the Globe and Mail. And for that work, he has been honored with many, many national journalism awards. In 2020, John received the prestigious Missioner Baxter Special Award from the Missioner Awards Foundation for long-term achievement in public service journalism. It is my great pleasure to now bring to the virtual stage John Fraser.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel. Welcome particularly to our author, Harvey Weingarten, who has produced a really important book, and one that I hope will bring a big debate. What I most appreciated about it was that, you don't want to mess too much with Harvey. You wouldn't want to be down the back alley if you didn't have your facts right. But he's got solutions. He's got suggested solutions, and that's part of the wonder of this book, is that he's not just out to make points, debating points. He's out to try and improve a system which he more or less approves of, but thinks could do a lot better. I did think that it was kind of brave of him to begin the book with a quote from an former American president and a university president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who said this challenging quote: changing a university curriculum is like moving a graveyard. You don't know how many friends the dead have until you try to move them. And so he's in a sense trying to, I guess, walk into this graveyard. We've got three very interesting people to talk about this. First of all, make a presentation themselves, and then talk among each other, and then we will try and answer questions. And first up is the wonderful Simona Chiozi. She was the higher education reporter at the Globe and Mail, also where I once worked very happily, until 2018, where she wrote investigations and features on colleges and universities in Canada. She also worked as the Globe's education and assistant news editor, and spent over 2 decades as a writer, producer, and editor in Canadian media. And she's currently teaching comparative politics at the Royal Conservatory of Music, and works in public affairs and government relations at the University of Toronto. So Simona, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. And I don't think our time overlapped, but yeah, it was a great place to work and a great place to be at U of T now. So hello, and thank you to U of T Press and to Harvey for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Harvey was one of the people who helped me understand higher education in Ontario and Canada when I got into the business of writing about our system. And I remain really thankful to him for his time and his insights. It's also a pleasure to be able to talk about a book on Canadian education and to listen to my fellow panelists who have so excellently served time in the trenches themselves. So I'd like to make an observation about the book and 2 points. I think first, I'm always thankful for a book that draws such a sharp contrast between the American and the Canadian university systems. They're too often conflated, as if their student debt numbers or hours or the crisis of their small universities are widely experienced here. And I see that there's already a question about crises in Ontario. But in fact, as the book underlines, Canada offers university education that combines access, affordability, quality, and continuing positive returns on investment. So Harvey writes, the probability that a child born to parents in the bottom quintile of income will reach the top quintile is about double in Canada than what it is in the United States. Canada appears to be doing better at fulfilling the American dream than the Americans. So where's the crisis? I think the crisis he identifies is actually in universities' ability to respond to what is happening outside of the classroom, what's happening in society, and in our willingness to allow universities to be engaged or even to lead a broad-based response. So there are 2 areas of crisis where the issues Harvey identifies suggest universities are not so much a cause of the crisis, but a symptom. and that in fact we could better leverage the institutions to be part of the solutions. And as John, you said, that is one of the great strengths of the book is the attention to solutions. So the first is growing inequality. The first crisis, I think, outside the universities and how we see it reflected is income inequality, income polarization, and the general sense that we see in the newspapers and among our friends and younger generations that people are having a much more difficult time reaching the same standard of life as their parents. Housing prices obviously being one of the first top examples here. So where can we lay the blame? Universities become good candidates because, as the book details, the income returns to a university education are consistent, but they can be uneven depending on the field of study and the gender, among two of the key factors and how they interact. A university education continues to provide higher lifetime income than a college degree or a high school graduation. We've been beaten over the head with this fact by universities for decades. But we also now have evidence that some groups lag. For example, men who pursue the arts appear to earn less than men with a university degree. I would argue that says more about how we value the arts, and I'll talk about that shortly, than about the intrinsic worth of a university degree in the humanities. Any discussion of income gains from university degrees has to be complemented, in my mind, however, by the recognition that we need to talk about the impact of university education on new households. So we should not just be talking about individual returns, but family returns. And here I'm thinking in particular of the trend toward what is called assortative mating. This is something that I did, come across in various conversations with university students in my prior job. And it's the tendency for similarly educated individuals to couple off. So multiple studies in Canada and the US have found that the increase in assortative mating is one of the explanations for rising income inequality. And if anything, the trend in Canada is more pointed and acute than it is in the United States. So in fact, university education makes it more likely that people will experience upward social mobility because it gives them the opportunities to meet similarly situated mates. The solutions to the effect of this phenomenon cannot be to question the return to a university education, but to encourage and enable more people to attend. In the meantime, there are policy levers that are being developed and discussed and researched in universities that address income inequality and that policymakers and decision makers can choose to activate and deploy, or they can choose not to, leading us to the situation in which we are now. The second area of crisis is the role of arts and humanities in our world. And I think here the book gives a very strong defense of both the long-term payoff to arts and humanities degrees and the necessity of revaluing the skills and capacities that they build. It's not a big part of the book, but it's one that runs counter to narratives in the media and the narratives we heard the other evening on the Ideas program as well. So I'd love to talk about that at some point in this discussion. The reality is that for the big challenges that we face, whether it's pandemics or climate change or automation or AI, science alone cannot solve these problems. We need the arts and humanities to help us think and feel through the crises and to bring new and underrepresented voices into the conversations and the stories we tell about how we want to solve these problems. So the book, I think, really rightly sounds the alarm that we devalue these fields at our peril. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona. That was wonderful. I'm really glad you mentioned the arts and humanities because, as you say, it wasn't a huge element in Harvey's book, but when it came in, it was like this big exclamation mark. And I was really heartened. And it comes to another area on how universities evaluate their students and how the role the arts can play in enhancing that evaluation. But that's for later discussion. Right now, I have the great pleasure of introducing Indira Samara Sakara, who's a senior advisor at Bennett Jones, LLP. If you don't know, that's a very distinguished law firm, and a corporate director. Internationally, she's recognized as one of Canada's leading metallurgical engineers, and she advises clients on mining, oil and gas, and environmental matters. She's a former president and vice chancellor of the University of Alberta. And I can't see visible scars, but I'm sure there are some internal ones. Anyone who's been a president and vice chancellor has scars. Indira is the recipient of multiple honorary degrees, and she was the vice president research at the University of British Columbia. and she's an officer of the Order of Canada and a foreign associate of the National Academy of Engineering. She's a distinguished fellow in residence at the Liu Institute for Global Issues at the University of British Columbia, and it's a great honor to hand the mic over to Indira.
Well, first of all, thank you, John. It is just a real pleasure to be here. My thanks to the University of Toronto Press and Harvey for allowing me to participate in what is a very, very timely discussion. Harvey, for the audience, Harvey and I were colleagues when he was president of University of Calgary. And I must say, quite unlike most university presidents in a given province who compete, Harvey reached out and we had a great collaboration. So Harvey, you know, I think you set the standard for how people can work together to make the system better. Your book could not come at a better time. When we look today at just what is the meaning of change, it really informs why reform is urgent, right? The pandemic, the catastrophic climate events. I mean, the entire town of Lytton burned down in minutes. And then you look at artificial intelligence, which is now enabling the work from anywhere, study from anywhere movement, along with some serious ethical issues. How universities respond is going to be crucial. Let me touch on two things I found particularly valuable in the book. I mean, the book was great, but these two, I mean, struck a kind of chord. The first one that Harvey has identified, which I think is urgently need of attention, is the whole issue of skills, right? The skills gap. And the World Economic Forum, of course, has had a skills report and identified the top 10 skills, many of which Harvey speaks about in his book. And the fact that these are what employers are perceiving as being a gap, whatever reason. Of the skills, the ones that caught my attention, in addition to the ones that Harvey mentioned in the book, are the following: leadership and social influence, technology use, monitoring and control, technology design and programming, resilience, stress tolerance and flexibility, and of course the other ones like critical thinking, complex problem solving, and so on. And Harvey, you know, raises this question, you know, and it occurs to me, have we ever seen a university transcript that provides an employer an assessment of these skills? Sure, we teach content and teach it very well, and we assume that they're getting these skills, but there's no explicit measure of this, and no explicit, if you will, ability of the curriculum to be shaping these skills in a way. And this brings me to the arts and humanities. You know, as an engineer, let me tell you, I have been passionate about the arts and humanities, because if we look at these skills, they have an important role to play in ensuring university graduates graduate with these skills. So, but I would also put out the challenge to the arts and humanities. You know, these disciplines have to become part of the solution, much like all disciplines have to be, rather than to say that in a way that they're being devalued. You know, how do they create their value proposition and make the case for their role in facilitating these skills, rather than being seen as operating in their narrow silos and not really contributing to the broader dialogue. So I'm going to throw out that challenge. Perhaps the scars I have as a university president, when I was told frequently that the arts and humanities was devalued, maybe brings out that one. The next area that Harvey tackles in his book, which I'd like to briefly talk about, is the performance of universities writ large, because governments, rightly or wrongly, look at the sort of overall performance in their ability to fund universities. And we have not done a good job in selling ourselves and our performance to the public and therefore to the governments, because publics elect governments. And Harvey, you talked about university rankings, bring back fond memories of the days when you and I participated in a bit of a revolt against Maclean's rankings, because we felt that they did not really tackle true performance measures. And I think that this is the opportunity that universities have. Sure, we excel in discovery research, we've created interdisciplinary institutes and so on. But let me point to what I think is the opportunity, and Harvey, this could be the sequel to your next book, and that is, how do universities demonstrate that they are stepping up to challenge the large scale problems that affect our society. And let me give you an example of one I think that is very heartening, that has recently occurred in Canada that maybe we didn't notice. And that is, Canada was the first country in the world to create a national strategy on artificial intelligence. Through CIFA, they created 3 institutes, the leading one of which is at the University of Toronto, one at the University of Montreal and the University of Alberta, with 125 million investment and a follow-on of 400 million to come, to coordinate our Canadian capacity on AI. Why is this significant? Well, it's significant because it not only allows a rapid growth, but it allows us to think about the ethical issues around AI. And this is where the humanities and social sciences have a huge role to play. And I think if you think about it, and the incredible carnage associated with Facebook, both in terms of its impact on our democracies, on our news media, on our young people, surely if we had had a strategy to deal with the ethical issues of social media, we might be ahead of the game. So I raised this question around the national strategies, and the results in just a couple of years of creating the AI initiative have been really impressive. Google Brain established its first Canadian lab. Facebook launched an AI research lab in Montreal. DeepMind chose Edmonton as its first international lab. We're beginning to see the important collaboration so universities can influence how the Facebooks and the Googles and all of these others pursue these technologies. So let me close by saying, Harvey, your book has really raised certainly our collective consciousness of what universities can and must do. And I throw out a question: should we then be establishing national and international strategies to deal with the other big challenges like climate change, energy transition, inequality, and the list goes on? Does it require a national conversation that is led by universities and therefore enhances our place in the public eye? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indira. Thank you. Well, there's a lot of good points you brought out, and we'll come back to them. And there's also, I can point out, there's lots of questions coming in from a large audience that's out there, and I've been trying to monitor them, and I'll keep doing that, and we'll get to them later. But right now, it's my honor and special pleasure to introduce Hugh Siegel, who was actually my successor at Massey College, but that's not what he's most famous for. He is a strategic advisor currently at the Airden Bairless, another equally distinguished law firm, and a distinguished fellow at both the Monk School of Global Affairs and the School of Policy Studies at Queen's. He's the 5th head of Massey College at the U of T, where he's a senior fellow, and he's the former chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee and the Special Senate Committee on Anti-Terrorism. He also served as Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mulroney and Associate Cabinet Secretary for Federal Provincial Relations in Ontario under Premier William Davis, and as President of the Institute for Research of Public Policy in Montreal. And also in an era when we tend to encourage bad things said about politicians, I think Hugh Siegel is one. We all remember his stand in the Senate, a very principled stand, and he gave great dignity and credit to an institution that Canadians didn't know enough about. So it was a great honor to pass it on to him.
Thanks, John, and colleagues. It's great to be here, and I'm delighted to say a word in support of the importance of Harvey's book and to recommend it to members of faculty, to members of Board of Trustees across the country, to high school students who are thinking about going to university, to undergraduate students who are thinking about graduate school, to parents who are thinking about helping their kids get to university, and above all, to advocates who are really fundamental in our society, who engage always on behalf of people beneath the poverty line, on behalf of racialized people who experience all kinds of unfair discrimination. There's a lot in this book that is relevant to all of those groups, and I recommend it highly. The purpose of the book has been suggested by a couple of my colleagues was to begin the debate. So I'm going to begin the debate by raising a couple of things where I disagree fundamentally with some of the substance of the book, and I do so with great affection for the writer, but for great appreciation of the importance of the discussion that we're about to have. I don't actually think It is the role of universities to prepare people for jobs. I don't see the role of universities as acting as extensions of the corporate community or the manufacturing community or the high-tech community or the public service community to prepare people to go to work. The role of the university is to give people an opportunity to learn about themselves, to learn about disciplines they might not know much about when they were in high school, to learn how to debate, to learn how to engage, to learn how to reflect, whether that's in the sciences or in the humanities, because in the end, a university is not an instrument of the economy. A university is an instrument of a society which is committed to democratic principles, to fundamental civility, to commitment to a broad measure of diversity, which is one of the great strengths of this country. And I think universities have to look at themselves in the context of how they measure up against those really important criteria. And to be fair to Harvey, his book deals with many chunks of that in a very thoughtful and constructive way. Where I think we need to be realistic for a moment is that governments can't have it both ways. They can't, on the one hand, for example, say we're providing so much funding per student and so much capital funding to universities, but of course, they're independently run by their own boards of governors. They are established by separate acts of the legislature, as the case may be, and then look the other way when a university like our friends at Laurentian get into the soup, on the one hand, and on the other hand say, well, of course, they are really extensions of our public policy goals, and they have a duty to deliver on the measures to which we are committed as governments of this political party or that political party. You can't have it both ways. And that's what government is trying to do. And I think that is one of the burdens, if I may say so, upon what is otherwise a competent, highly engaged, intellectually acute, broad, and I think humane post-secondary system in this country. I would also make the point that if we're thinking about the way in which a society deals with its challenges and its divisions, which every broad mass democracy will have, the role of universities in helping people learn not only how to deal with divisions of opinion, but how to engage in those debates in a fashion that is actually constructive and frank and direct, but not destructive, I think is very, very important. So I think that in the end, we have to look at the many thoughtful recommendations that is made by Harvey in this book in the terms of achieving that goal. I don't worry that General Motors or the Royal Bank of Canada will be unable to find employees unless universities teach people how to be those employees. I think those institutions, and we have seen this in the past, have been reaching out. A lot of scientific organizations and a lot of high-tech organizations have been reaching out to humanities graduates, not because they had a specific skill set or series of disciplines that were immediately supportive of that kind of work, but because they were, as employers, happy about the competence and the ability to think and reflect, and they took it upon themselves to ensure the basic instrumental skills to work in those places were provided as part of their orientation. The legal profession does that in terms of students who go into law firms for periods of time and build up a skill set before they're called to the bar. The medical profession does that in terms of interns and medical students who are part of the day-to-day operation in hospitals and healthcare services. So I think it's important that universities remember why we are here. And we are here to ensure that the core values of our society and the premises around intellectual acuity, open-mindedness, and engagement are sustained by the mix of activities, discipline, and teaching, and research, which goes on in our institutions. Harvey touches on all of that. He's a bit more, shall we say, understanding of the role of government, and not as critical as I would have hoped he might have decided to be at this particular point in his remarkable career. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Hugh. This is a man who knows the political circuit, and he started a debate. Harvey, why don't we just pass it right back to you at this moment to answer Hugh Siegel's interesting disagreement on the role of universities, if in fact that's what you said. Your mute is on, Harvey, so.
I make some of my best comments when I'm muted, but let me say this. I agree. The role of the university is not to prepare people for jobs, even though, may I say, every student survey I know of in the last 20 years that has asked students for the dominant reason they go to university, they tell you, not the exclusive response, but the dominant response is we need these credentials and the knowledge to get a good job. But I would say much of the emphasis in the book is not about preparing people for jobs, but for giving them the skills that, yes, will serve them well in their careers, but serves them well in the decisions they are going to be asked to make in their life. If you go to physicians now and you say, I have some medical condition, what are my treatment options? They present you with a variety of treatment options that each one has a risk and side effect and cure rate associated with it. And you have to be able to navigate and figure out which is the best treatment option for you. When you buy a house, you have to decide whether you're better advised to get a variable rate mortgage or to lock yourself into an interest rate for 5 years. When we have an election campaign, and I'm sorry I have to raise election campaigns in an otherwise uplifting discussion, you have to make an evaluation of whether the things the political class is telling you, which are the one you want to affiliate with. And those skills require a capacity to read, to analyze, to problem solve, and do most of our universe. And that's the decisions we have to make in life. So I would say that while it's true that so much of the discourse has to do with preparation for jobs, what's fascinating to me is that the skills that the employers are saying they need in their future hires, and the ones that they're identifying as being most efficient, and the ones that the World Economic Forum tells us are the skills everyone will need in the future. This is a skill set that any university should be proud to address itself to and to teach to, because they are a series of generic skills like critical thinking, like communication, like problem solving, like critical appraisal, working with others, leadership, that we need in everyone. Important for life, important for work. And I just think we could design a curriculum that does a better job of fostering those skills and making sure that students graduate with them. I'm sorry I disappointed you about how critical I was about government. And you know that when I'm in mute or sitting at a Starbucks with you, I can be far more critical. And I'll simply say this, there's no point in being too critical because they must be part of the solution. For better, for worse, in Canada, the university system, like healthcare, like so many other of the public sectors in Canada, must involve engagement with government. You could argue we should have a different kind of system, but that's the system we have. And so if we are going to make reforms, if we are going to change, if we are going to improve, if we are going to go from good to great, there will be by necessity an engagement with government and the institutions working with them to their, what I hope they would see as common goals. Right now, we're not there. Government sees universities not as the enemy, but not as helpful as they can be. And part of the comments I make in the book is how can universities talk about themselves, advertise themselves, relate to the public, engage with the public, engage with employers, engage with governments in ways that'll develop a more harmonious relationship and a more nurturant relationship and purposeful relationship between government and the public universities. Because if we don't have that trust and confidence, I'm not that optimistic that we're going to get anywhere. And I'm not there now. And I have more confidence in the smart people who work in universities to figure out how to make this relationship work than I sometimes do by looking at the politicians.
Indira, that gauntlet that Hugh threw down, actually, you probably have something to say about that too, because you yourself have run a university, and I'm wondering if you had any embellishments to what Harvey was saying, or any agreement with what Hugh was saying.
So, I mean, my answer is two sides of a coin. I completely agree with Harvey on his thesis that the skills that we're talking about are important for a society and for the citizens. You know, our job is not to train, you know, citizens to be carpenters, as I just heard, or our job is to educate carpenters to be citizens. So I do agree with Harvey that these skills are absolutely essential. And this is where I maybe agree with Hugh. Yes, universities during, you know, for a long time have been doing that, teaching people to think and so on, as opposed to for jobs. But I don't think we're doing as good a job as we did before. And let me tell you why. I'll give you an anecdote. When I was president of University of Alberta, a professor came up to me and said, Madam President, students have no time to think. There's too many courses and too many this and too many that, and we're loading more and more and cramming more and more. And I looked at him and said, why are you telling me this? I said, it's up to you. You're faculty of science, you're in the Department of X. You guys need to figure out that we teach less content, right? Less content and more critical thinking skills. So I think Harvey's point about reform is to ask the question, given the rate at which content is developing, should we be focusing on ensuring that everyone who graduates has the full content, because the content's going to become irrelevant in 2 or 3 years, whether it's in medicine or in engineering or even in the arts, right? New knowledge is coming out. And the question is, can we reform the curriculum so that those skills that I think Harvey has correctly pointed to can be measured and delivered through the curriculum?
Thanks, Indira. And Simona, you bestride an interesting pair of fields, both journalism and the academy. And I was interested that the U of T started an innovative program a little while back that I got involved in a bit, to the National News Media Council, where graduate students could take a study in journalism, because it was understood that popular journalism, popular intelligent journalism, was going to play a role perhaps in their fields. And this was an attempt by the university to equip these students who were specialists in their field to understand how to make their appeals to public. And I thought that was an interesting example of what Harvey was saying. I don't know if Hugh would agree with whether that was a good thing to do or not. But I'm wondering, Simona, have you seen in your bestriding of these two areas reasons to have some hope that the academy is dealing appropriately with what society needs from it?
Okay, huge question. Thank you, John. I think that what we're talking about there is the public engagement, right? What kind of loosely falls under the rubric of public engagement in universities, and how should faculty engage with the public? And, you know, it touches on this issue of, should universities lead or be, I think there's a question in the chat about, should universities lead or be catalysts in solving challenges and getting involved in the debates? And in both cases, you need to have internal faculty members and emerging scholars who are able to engage along the terms and in the language that the public understands. Because I'll say that one thing that's difficult is, if we are going to talk about universities as places that are not primarily valued for their ability to deliver a return on investment to students and families, if we're going to look at the broader mission and the critical capacities and skills, and translate that to impact, to government and to the public, okay, it's already difficult enough to persuade government of the value of universities, even though it's talking about jobs for a good few decades. How do we then move to persuading them that universities are valuable for the other reasons, for the critical reasons? And I'm not sure, like U of T has this co-curricular record, which is incredibly valuable for students to show employers what they've done outside of their classes. But I'm not sure that that's the kind of big initiative that we need to persuade government and the public of the value of university leadership. So, you know, you give up something when you don't focus as much on content and you focus more on the skills. I think internally, the discussion right now within universities is around how do you change the metrics of tenure? How do you change the elements that lead to somebody having the scholarly recognition, whether that's tenure or, and there's questions about tenure as well, in order to account for the fact that we need more public engagement, or at least we think we need more public engagement. So there's a lot of elements wrapped up in there, but that would sort of be my answer. There's so many initiatives. Once you start to work in a university, I mean, what I've seen is, as a journalist, you know, you're always putting stories, and there's this great initiative and that initiative, but the overwhelming number of projects and initiatives and desire to contribute inside universities, I don't think people are aware of that. How does all those initiatives amount to a leadership role is something that everyone's trying to figure out and to get other people to understand.
Harvey, do you want to say anything before we move on to the next question, because we've got loads of questions? Then I'm going to throw out to you, first of all, Harvey, a question from someone who describes himself as a former colleague of both Indira and you. His name's Daniel Wolf, and he says there are three major obstacles to change, and can he defend individually but collectively have created an almost immovable block to change? And those three items, no surprise, one is tenure, two is collective agreements, and third is an end to mandatory academic retirement. And with this trio, how can change actually happen? So I'll start with Harvey, and I'll go around and see if anyone else has anything else to say about the three riders of the academic apocalypse, apparently.
So thank you, Daniel, for crystallizing the reflections of a former university president at Queen's. And I presume you're revealing to us some of the scars you have from the time you had that role. So let me say this. At our peril, do we tinker with the tenure system, unless all of North America collectively decides that we're not going to have tenure anymore. I mean, that kind of happened at the UK. The world didn't come to an end. But the reality is that if we want to be competitive for faculty in a North American context, if we get rid of tenure, we put ourselves at a terrible competitive disadvantage. And I understand the reasons for tenure, brought in 1915 to protect the inextricably linked to the concept and to the requirement that university professors had academic freedom and could exercise academic freedom. So I don't object to the issue of tenure at all. And I do wish that sometimes when some of the things I see going on university campuses now, that most people remembered why we have tenure, to allow for civil, open debate on controversial issues rather than some of the culture we have now. That's one. Most faculty in Canadian universities are unionized. They are subject by collective agreements. I don't see that as the major impediment. Yes, we have written a lot in my former life about mandatory retirement. I am not here recommending that it's a good thing to have mandatory retirement at age 65 or not. Supreme Court, people smarter than me, have ruled on this issue several times. Simply to say that whether you have mandatory retirement or not influences the sustainability of the system, the ability for us to renew the professoriate, and those are the issues we have to deal with. So in a nutshell, I'd say this. I understand that these are hot button issues: tenure, collective agreements, mandatory retirement. But in my view, even within that framework, we could do a much better job than we're doing now to deliver on the purposes and the contributions of the university. What it requires, though, is a shared commitment to the purposes of the university. The faculty and the government and that university administrators, I think we have to share a sense of, what are we here to do? What is the purpose of the university? What is my role as a faculty person or as an instructor at the university? And within the structures we have of tenure, collective agreements, and mandatory retirement, have we given ourselves the tools? Have we given ourselves the goals that we can work on collectively? And while some might argue that the things you've identified are impediments, I just regard them as part of the ecosystem and we'll work within them. But really what we're missing here is a shared commitment to the purpose of the university, to what we have to do, and a willingness to be a little bit more risky, innovative, creative than we are now, to focus on ourselves to the central purpose of the university, which is to educate our students and prepare them for their future lives. And if we focused on that, even within the things you mentioned, there's a lot I think we could accomplish.
Indira, would you have anything to add to that?
Well, let me, first of all, Daniel, delighted you're on the call. Daniel Wolf, principal of Queen's University, I think he did a remarkable job at Queen's, you know, despite these very real challenges. Let me say, you know, I don't often disagree with Harvey, but I have a different perspective on this. Tenure was there for academic freedom. It has now become, if you will, entangled with the whole notion of performance. In other words, you cannot evaluate the performance of a university, of an academic, and in a way, you know, deny tenure or have them removed for performance because they have tenure. It's impossible. And so we tolerate substandard performance in some cases because of tenure. So here's the solution. And Harvey and Daniel will remember this well because we were all in the Alberta system where tenure was not a protection against poor performance or inadequate performance, because the faculty councils are the ones who made the decision, not the president, not the provost. And if a professor got 2 zeros 2 years in a row, they were out, whether they had tenure or not. Here was the problem, that the faculties would not, the departments and the academics would not judge their colleagues fairly. They were afraid that it would come back to haunt them. The other problem, I think, with tenure in Canada is we give it too soon. I think if you look at the American universities, the elite universities, they don't give tenure for 10 years. It takes 10 years for a person to demonstrate that they are truly an international expert in their field. So I would argue, I would agree with Daniel that tenure, the way it's currently constructed, is actually an impediment for us to make reforms. And we have to really think about how we deal with it.
Can I just reinforce one point Indira makes? Because Indira and her colleague Martha Piper just wrote a wonderful book called Nerve, which speaks to the importance of having some courage and nerve if you're a leader. We need courageous university leaders, and Indira is absolutely right. I cannot tell you how many deans have come to me in my provost or presidential roles and said to me, these are 3 faculty members who are clearly performing below expectations. We have to get rid of them. And I said, so go do it. They said, we can't, they have tenure. I said, no, you're wrong. Evaluate them, give them a 0 on their annual performance evaluation, do that 2 years in a row. And yes, Indira's right, in Alberta, that's dismissal. And they won't do it. So if we don't have courageous university leaders, we're not going to get anywhere here.
Okay, the questions are pouring in, so I'm not going to do a round of everyone on the same issue. I think I want to go to Simona because one came in early wanting to have some insight on what we're supposed to learn from the catastrophe at Laurentian University. And I think I'd like to ask Simona to address that one because it's a kind of wart there on the whole system on several levels.
Okay, I'll do my best. I mean, I have been sort of out of the business of covering anything but U of T for a few years, so it's difficult. But I want to maybe tie it in with, maybe answer it in a broader way and tie it in with this debate that is starting now about tenure, which is an interesting place for this panel to go and the audience to go. But I think we're having this debate about how to reform universities, while at the same time, the emerging scholars, people who are, you know, recent PhD graduates or hoping to teach in the academy, are thinking about how can I join this institution and what are the conditions, as people say, what are the conditions of my work? And the conditions of work for new scholars are overall, perhaps not at Canada's leading universities, but outside of the system, are more difficult than used to be the case. So even having a tenure track position, as some of the comments, in leading to this on Twitter talked about, is really difficult. And so I think there can be a feeling that you're getting the rug pulled out from under you, just as a new generation, more representative, and I'm not talking, more representative, more diverse, with different views, better able to publicly engage, exactly all the things that we need in universities to be able to have them be catalysts. This generation is the one that is going to not enjoy the same ability to debate freely as a prior generation. So I think my answer as an observer to what happened in Ontario is that I have confidence that most universities in Ontario have proper accounting in place and do not use research funds as general funds. And that's really what it's about. And so I think, to me, is there a sustainability discussion? Yes. Is there a government funding discussion? Yes. Is there a need for universities in remote regions? Absolutely. And we need to do whatever we can, but we also need, that's why you have governing boards, is to look at problems that arise before they become catastrophic, as happened in that case.
John, can I make one comment about Laurentian?
I want to ask you a question about government. Okay. Go ahead, Harvey.
Look, what happened at Laurentian is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the university. It's a tragedy for the students. It's a tragedy for the region. But let's be clear about something. If you go back to the financial records of Laurentian University as early as 2012, you knew they were in deep financial trouble. If you look back at the financial records of Laurentian University from 2015, it was clear that they were using restricted funds, grant funds, restricted trust accounts to pay operating expenses, to pay the electrical bills. In 2017, the Higher Education Quality Council wrote a report to the government on the sustainability of the Canadian universities. And we identified that most were okay, but Laurentian was in terrible shape. It was outstanding in how bad it was. If you look at the available public record, the current president of Laurentian, when in his affidavit, when he went to seek creditor protection, indicated that in the last faculty negotiation 2019, they indicated at the bargaining table to the faculty that Laurentian University was running out of money. It was going to go bankrupt. He couldn't predict when, but it was going to go bankrupt. So these are all clear in the financial statements. So what is the lesson here? Since at least 2012, we knew we had a serious problem and was only getting worse. The university knew, the board knew, the government knew, because all of these reports go to government. What did we do about it? Nothing. Until it hit a crisis, until we hit a tragedy. And if there's a central lesson in the book, it's why don't we take a clear-minded, realistic look at the state of universities and try to really seriously address the problems we have, because we know what they are. And there's a lot of people providing potential solutions to them. But to stick your head in the sand and ignore it and hope this goes away, this is a recipe for tragedy.
You, as the one member of this panel that has the most experience on what government can or cannot do, what it's likely to do, do you have any insight on what happened at Laurentian that might have been helped by government intervention, or was it all too late and impossible to attend to from that standpoint?
John, I think it's a very good question. I think what's really interesting here is regardless of whether the funding difficulties at Laurentian were because of decisions that were made at Laurentian by their own administration and staff, or because of other funding and cost trends which were unsustainable. the government of Ontario has moved on many occasions to deal with hospitals who are heading in the same direction. There have been many occasions in the past 10, 20 years where the government Ministry of Health has appointed an administrator to take over the hospital, to run the hospital. The board was changed to deal with financial difficulties, and they did it long before the hospital actually faced financial collapse. They did it because it was the responsible thing to do. So I think what happened in Laurentian was that governments decided they weren't going to do that, that post-secondary education was not as important as health. And on that basis, they looked the other way and figured it's not their problem. And I think that's a sign of either malignant disinterest in the quality of post-secondary education on the part of the government, or simple incompetence. Either way, it's unacceptable. There should have been and could have been, based on what Harvey has talked about, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a proper administrator appointed to work with the Board of Trustees to deal with the changes that had to be made to make the university financially viable in a way that would not have been as destructive to students, by the way, who are trying to finish their programs, and that region of the province. Now, the university will survive, and it will survive, and I think over time it will thrive, but the notion that nobody did anything when it's government's direct responsibility to have done so speaks to the extent to which government does not view that kind of problem as intrinsic to their mission, when education is actually under Section 92, one of provincial government's most important responsibility. And I think that's what happened. It was the government's different affiliations politically just said, not our problem. Guess what? It is, it was, they ignored it, and a whole bunch of relatively innocent people living in the north and studying at that university have paid an unreasonable price.
Yeah, good answer, Hugh. Thank you. Listen, moving on, there's a guy I want to give a shout out to. His name's Dan Mills, and he's probably showered this discussion with about half a dozen questions. There's one directly to Harvey, and he says, Dan Mills says, Harvey, do you have any confidence that the university world will willingly follow any of your recommendations, or do they all have to be pushed into by government?
You can't be a senior university administrator and not have a DNA composition that leads you to be optimistic and confident about the future. So I'm always confident. That said, I think if you looked at a realistic assessment of what's going on now is that universities internally, I would argue, are not taking reform and change and curriculum reform, are not pursuing it as vigorously and as aggressively and as purposefully as I would hope. Who is really driving the university agenda now? It is government. So when governments use comment is spot on, governments have a legitimate response and a responsibility to be public stewards of important public sectors and the right use of public funds. And they are the ones, not just in Canada, but in other countries as well, who are driving the university agenda. They are the ones who are bringing in different funding formulas to try to push universities in a particular direction. They are far more willing, governments now, to be intrusive in the practices and policies of universities than they were 5, 10 years ago, especially true in Ontario. So, and I also have some sympathy for the university administrators who live in they're politicians as much as the premier is, and they live in a very difficult political dynamic. And no matter how courageous and creative they are, they need sometimes the assistance and cover of government to make some of the changes in their universities that they need. So in my view, governments are essential to motivating change. I don't see as much conversation going on in governments, in universities as I would have hoped. You know the saying, you don't change unless there's a crisis. Some people might have argued that the pandemic should have been that crisis to lead to change. Doesn't appear to have had as much of a change or has motivated as much change as some people would have hoped. And Lord knows you don't want a pandemic to motivate change. Bottom line, there are a lot of smart people who understand universities. They work in the universities. If you look at the political class and the civil service, they are not as expert about universities as the university people themselves. If we could develop actually a trusting, confident, harmonious conversation between government and universities to initiate the kind of reforms they need and drive towards common goals, we would be much better off. We're very far from that now.
Indira, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I want to make a distinction between provincial and federal government.
Okay.
Because let me say that if I look at successive federal governments, going back to Prime Minister Chrétien, and these are liberal and conservative governments, Prime Minister Harper and now Prime Minister Trudeau, the one thing that the federal government has understood has been that the investments in research were essential to creating the kind of knowledge and competitiveness. We may argue whether it's enough funding, whether it's in the right areas. We can argue about all that, but I have to shout out to our federal government and our political leaders. The problem is with the provincial governments. Just take a look at Alberta, right? You could get whiplash at the rate at which provincial government funding is changed. And if you look at, and this of course, Hugh will understand the dilemma. Countries like Australia, funding of universities is a national priority. It's under the umbrage of the federal government. Now we have a problem with our constitutional division of responsibilities, but therein lies the rub. We've got real problems with provincial governments and their understanding of universities and funding.
Great, thanks very much. I'm sorry, I'm trying to monitor a Niagara of questions that are pouring in here, Harvey. We won't be able to get to all of them. Thank everyone for doing it. I did want to put to Harvey something I think was quite fun. It's from a guy named Jeff Weingarten. And he says he's a nephew and a young prof. And he says he admires his uncle's courage. But as a young prof, do you think there are things that young professors can do to contribute to a better future? And what could a young professor like him offer to a system in need of such serious reimagining? I think that's a good question from inside the family circle. So I'm going to put it right on Harvey. Your nephew's
Thank you for the question. I'll be brief. You teach. A lot of you may not like the situation you're in. Many more of you would like to be and probably should be in tenure track and tenured positions. And they are hard to come by. But we have a lot of people like you, contract faculty teaching. So keep in mind when you teach a course on communication or culture or political science or history, what is it you really want your students to learn, to know, and be able to do as a result of taking your course, and structure your curriculum and course appropriately. Don't be discouraged. You are the catalyst for change, and we would be well advised to get more young professors into the profession in a more integrated way than they are now. And that's part of the reason some people gravitate to the issue, as our colleague Daniel Wolf did before, about mandatory retirement.
Thanks. I'm going to move on to try and get some more questions in. And there's one from Wendy Hoko, which the U of T Press would like us to answer live here. It's an interesting question. What are some ways we can reform or revolutionize the system to enable more BIPOC, queer, or disabled people not only to enter with less precarity, but also to thrive, not survive, thrive within, i.e. make it to retirement, whether early or on time? Those faculty and administration people who belong to the demographic groups that created the PSE system are far more able to excel and outlast. I'm going to throw it right back to Harvey again to see if he's put any thinking in this area.
Yeah, it's a terrific and important question. One of the chapters in the book is about access to the Canadian university system. And one of the things it points out is that even though we have a wonderfully accessible system, it's really quite unique in some ways. not every segment of society has equal access to our universities. And all the research we have suggests to us that if you can get these currently underrepresented students into post-secondary, they will reap all of the benefits, financial and social, that the university system has to offer. So it's really an issue of access. The other thing, it really is an issue of access, and the book speaks to the various methods that we know to increase representation of diverse student groups into our universities. There will be some others who will make this comment, and you can evaluate it for what you wish. We are now seeing some universities who are quite deliberately trying to redress the issue that you're raising by specifically focusing faculty appointments and restricting them to certain ethnic and cultural groups. That's okay. People, again, universities decide on how they want to recruit. But I would direct people to an article that was actually published in the New York Times today by the commentator Bret Stephens, who reminds us that fundamentally, universities are meritocracies and have to strive for excellence. Let's not lose the striving for excellence and excellence in all of the hiring, again, with clear focus and attention to the fact that our public institutions should reflect the makeup of Canada. And we have some work to do there.
Okay, I think our time is getting to a close, but one of the really hugely important areas in this book, I'm looking for my minder at U of T Press. Can I get one more question in, do you think, Chris?
I think you can do one quickly here, John. So let's.
Okay, quick, sure. It's about innovation. It's probably one of the most important factors in the book, but maybe I'll just put it to Harvey to have the last word. You certainly were strong in this book on that Canadian universities are letting the innovation strand of their mandate fall by the wayside. And I thought it was devastating when you pointed out that the two of the most innovative things that are Canadian universities were both about 50 years old, the medical school at McMaster and the engineering program at Waterloo. I wonder if you could give us a quick overview of what needs to be done to help universities get more innovation in their programs.
First of all, read Indira's book. It's about courage of administrators. If you have to have people who are willing, let me tell you, trying to promote something innovative, creative at a university, you will show the scars and the battle scars. And if you don't have courage, and if you're not tenacious, and you're not willing to have slings and arrows of being thrown at you, then you're not going to do it. So first of all, political courage. Second of all, government's got to get off the backs of the universities. We are subject to such a strong and constrained regulatory burden from the universities. They are, from the governments, I'm sorry. They are squelching opportunities for innovation. Oddly enough, as I show in the book, the quality assurance mechanisms we have in Canada do more to squelch innovation than actually promote quality. Mm-hmm. So let 1,000 flowers bloom, take some risks, be innovative, be courageous. Many of those innovations will be good, some will fail, and we have to tolerate those failures.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to tolerate the time constraints here. This is sort of like asking 1,000 flowers to grow in the palm of your hand. We just simply don't have enough time or space to get to all of these issues. But I think that that's a sign that that there is much to be discussed, and that just a sign of how Harvey's book sort of helps to frame the conversation. I would really like to, on behalf of UTP, I would like to thank Hugh, Indira, Simona, and John for taking part in today's conversation and celebration of Harvey's book. It is now available on the UTP website, and obviously this conversation will be the first of many. But I think that it is, a wonderful way to celebrate the arrival of this book. So congratulations, Harvey, and we look forward to the next book, perhaps nothing less than Great Her. So anyway, thank you all very much, Hugh, Indira, Simona, and John, for taking part today. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.